So, learners, today in this lecture, I am going to illustrate how gendered representations in media basically make us think about what we have been discussing through the works of Stuart Hall and Richard Dyer in understanding representations, issues of stereotypes, etc. So, the topic of today's discussion is gendered representations, and what we are going to do first is talk about feminist media perspectives through the lens of Margaret Gallagher, who says that the starting point for Western feminists was Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which was also a searing critique of the mass media. And this work was important from the point of view of understanding how women and feminist issues were represented. At a global level, one saw that the United Nations International Decade for Women 1975 to 85 was a catalyst for debate about many sides of women's subordination, while the media's role as a specific source of oppression was actually documented in the reviews initiated by the UNESCO. So, you could see that the media was identified as a key suspect in this discourse and debate on women's subordination. And many of these early analyses, they found the media to be deeply implicated in the patterns of discrimination which operated against the women in society, patterns which through the absence, trivialization or condemnation of women in media content amounted to symbolic annihilation. And this is why the question of representation is important, that women were represented. We had discussed this in the feminist approach to understanding the media as well, that women had been represented, but these representations were through the lens of the male gaze. And therefore, the stereotypes, what they did was primarily trivialize, condemn as well as reduce women to content which would be considered to be symbolic annihilation or annihilation. The general critique quickly came to be positioned around two central axes. One is the analysis of the structures of power in which women are systematically subordinated, and a focus on the politics of representation and the production of knowledge in which women are objects rather than active subjects. So, women have been looked at as objects, as we have discussed already, and therefore, this production of knowledge, how is knowledge on women, of women, by women produced become important, as well as the politics of representation, that how are women represented, which is why this question that we are asking and trying to answer, that is it enough if only they are represented, or should we go beyond representation? So, the two concerns were addressed in many studies of the late 1970s and early 1980s as problems of women in the profession and images of women in the media. So, this is something that you may have already seen and heard, that there have been sort of discussions on how women are represented, how women in the profession operate. And they have gradually come together to produce a complex analysis of the structure and process of representation, the cultural and economic formations that support these, the social relations that produce gendered discourse, and the nature of gendered identity. Why are women represented in a particular way? This question can also be answered by the cultural and economic formations. For instance, why are shows or comedy, products that highlight women's roles and women's actions as humorous, avidly watched? These become humorous and avidly watched because there is a social structure, patriarchy, which supports that content. And the wife jokes that you find being circulated on, social media, etc., they reflect that kind of representation. The inadequacies of feminist theorizing, which conflated the condition of white heterosexual middle class women with the condition of all women were highlighted in North America by Black and Latina feminists, in Britain by Black and Asian feminists, and also by analysis of lesbian feminists. But these critiques evoked the concepts of interlocking identities and interlocking oppressions, and something today which we also understand as intersectionalities, where the focus is on not just gender, but how gender intersects with other identities. One actually sees that the stereotypes and representations of women have very seminal have very critical intersectional implication, as one can see how black women may be represented versus white women, etc. Related and more radical analysis actually came from feminist scholars in the third world, where many different agendas were needed, and these critics highlighted the irrelevance of Western feminism's analytical frameworks to the lives of most women around the world, and they also attempt to reposition the feminist debates within broader social, economic and cultural context of analysis. So, because feminism is also a very diverse movement, it is not homogeneous, there are multiple layers to it. So, when we are trying to understand the questions of representation of women and women's issues, we also should keep in mind that we have to understand it from the perspective of interlocking oppressions and identities and intersectionalities. And therefore, representation is not only about representation of women in the way that we understand privileged women to be, but also women from all corners of the world. Now, how do we speak about women and approach the media content? The question of how women are spoken for or spoken about is actually at the heart of the feminist critique of media content, and then its implications in how gender is constructed. How women are basically spoken for by the males, as well as spoken about primarily by the men, become very crucial to understanding questions of representation. There is a disjuncture between the image and reality, which also becomes profound when the governments attempt to mobilize people for social change. So, in a retrospective analysis, Graham Brown gives examples from post-independence Algeria and Nasser's Egypt, where modernist and westernized images of women were used as emblems of progress and enlightenment. The very same kind of images have also been used in Iran and Afghanistan, often invoking this question that when women are represented in media, what kind of ideas of progress and enlightenment are connected to those representations. So, are women enlightened and progressive if they are wearing Western clothing in the images circulated on mass media, or progress somehow gets tied to the sartorial choices? Now, in this understanding, what is also missing is a nuanced view of bodily autonomy. However, in the later part of this lecture, when we talk about the Indian case, we will also see how representations on the women's issues in mass media can be looked at through the lens of choice, autonomy, etc. In most ways, many of these mass media debates also highlight how the argument rests on choice. So, if there are women who cover their bodies, they would say that it is their choice, and this is also projected in mass media as choice feminism. However, one of the largest and most interesting goals of the feminist movement was also to question structures of oppression like religious bodies and patriarchal structures. So, anything that is rooted in these structural oppressions can then it also be understood as a choice feminist move is also something that we need to talk about. Now, in Egypt, according to feminist scholar Lila Abu Lughod, the ideological message of certain national interest television serials, they conflict with the experience of life in particular communities. Women actually emerge as the sacred markers of culture, which is a point that is illustrated also in Dulali Nag's analysis of contemporary sari advertisements in Bengal, which are designed to appeal to the urban middle class women, and these ads, they mingle images of what would be seen as rural utopia, the high culture of Bengali poets, women's domesticity to conjure up a notion of the essential Bengali tradition. What you see is basically Nag and Abu Lugo talking about, the women as the markers and protectors of culture, and these images are represented in mass media through the idea of tradition. So, women become the bearers of tradition. They have to be the ones to wear traditional clothes like sari or the hijab or the burqa, and they are entrusted with the responsibility of representing their culture and their country well. What you see is the media also basically playing a role in creating these representations. Now, in the Indian context, I want to use this essay called Feminism in Print Media by Maitri Chaudhary, an Indian sociologist, to basically locate the issue of feminism in the institutional context of the print media, where we discover two popular versions of feminism that the media promotes. One is a feminism of choice and the other is traditional feminism. It's really interesting also to think about the women's movement, questions of gender today, as we are juggling with content on, how women are also undergoing tremendous pressure because of working both at home and outside. At the same time, what we also see is an expression of hostility basically to organized women's movements. Women's activism is not seen positively, and there is a simultaneous co-optation as well as backlash. And what you see is basically that some of feminism demands like equality being seen with a lot of skepticism, and the agenda of feminism placed in the interest of a new liberalized economy. This discussion also basically should be rooted in the backdrop of how the women's issues and women's movements, women's organizations have played a great role in public lobbying against gender violence, and this has a huge history, especially even in the pre-independence era, where there were multiple women's rights movements and organizations that took up issues of women and wanted, better women's rights. And it continued in the late 1970s, where the media also played a role. So, what one actually saw was Indian feminism being defined by certain very specific issues like the dowry deaths or the Mathura rape case, as it happened in the 1970s and 80s, where women's rights groups played a very significant role in bringing about positive legal rights for women of affected communities, as well as situations where they could claim those rights. Many of these rights that we have today cannot be taken for granted. They were not given to us as charity or as benevolence, but were demands that were fought in the streets. And what happened is that this history also has a kind of understanding where this movement was, primarily upper caste and urban oriented. So, the critique of the women's movement in India has been that it hasn't really focused on the intersectionalities of the Indian context, like caste, class, region, ethnicity, religion, etc. And the question of women and how women can be discussed in the public sphere has been really significant as well. The women's question is, in fact, is a big part of the public discourse, where there is a lot of discussion on how women should be. There is a great visibility on women's rights and issues, but at the same time there is also great hostility. This hostility has been theorized as the feminist backlash, where it is a phrase used to talk about how, because women have achieved certain rights, there is also a backlash towards not just women's rights, but also the feminist movement itself, which has made many of these rights possible. Nonetheless, the discussions on women empowerment in media are very significant, and we see examples of these in everyday life, as well as how it unfolds in non-everyday and extraordinary contexts. The process of neoliberalization and commercialization also means that women's rights, women's issues themselves have been commercialized. Now, the Times of India was an early starter in this process of commercialization, where it underwent dramatic transformations with the management deciding on increased circulation, a cut in prices, and an explicit thrust on procuring advertisements, a shift from tenured editorial staff to contractual, to a point where they only had a managing editor. What one can see is the transformation of the public sphere, as we have discussed earlier, as well as the propaganda model at work, which we discussed in this unit. Now, what one sees is this transformation in terms of a newspaper from disseminating news to also becoming more consumerist. The Hindu, it remained more conservative, but at the same time, it also seeked to construct a profile for itself through advertisements, marketing it as a serious person's newspaper, where the successful corporate executive would find the information they require in the globalized times. You see that these newspapers and the public sphere, the press, they were catering to particular audience groups and target groups. Interestingly, Femina was among the first women's magazines in India, with the upper class and the middle class urban women as basically an intended audience. And unlike Savvy, which the management of Femina defines as aggressively feminist, Femina takes a balanced position. So, Femina sought to locate itself between what they would see the very upmarket Savvy and the middle class women's era. What you see through this explanation of the Femina is also how they did not want the feminist image. Now, this is again very interesting in the way that neoliberalism presents women's choices and women's rights. Many people will say that they support women's rights and women's causes, but they are not feminist. Very, interesting way to see how feminism gets disassociated from women's rights and women's issues. And this is where the role of the media is important, particularly as this case study of the print media illustrates. The Cosmopolitan, it advertises itself as basically something which targets an even more upmarket audience with a thrust on glamour, fashion and sex, and features often that are taken from the Western media. There is also a sexualization of content, and this is something which has been connected also to neoliberalization. And in one of the previous classes, I had mentioned that in certain advertisements which are not about sexual products, there is an element of sexualization. What you see is liberalization leading not only to a massive growth of the media business, but also to very differentiated market needs and distinct target audiences. So, while originally in the public sphere the target of the newspapers would be the reading public, in this context, the public itself is varied in nature. So, the print media, it undergoes dramatic transformations with the onset of liberalization, where it refers to the opening up of the Indian economy by the Indian state to enable it to be more integrated into the global economy. And what you see is the impact of liberalization and then the debates on it. So, this idea of feminism is choice, women's activism is imposition was a big part of how the media represented these issues, where you see that the language of self-reliance and non-alignment of a pre-liberalized era also stemmed for a desire from freedom and dignity. Also stemmed from a desire for freedom and dignity. So, in the Indian independence movement, women's issues were tied up with issues of freedom and dignity, and there is a clear break with this notion of freedom, primarily because what you see is that the individual is talking about choice and they are talking about free to choose. So, what happens now is that freedom is assumed and choice is seen as part of that freedom. So, what generally had happened is that many left groups played a very visible role in the women's movement, and autonomous women's groups have also taken up questions of economic deprivation and matters of class. And as I had earlier outlined, the Dalit women's movement in turn expressed dissatisfaction with upper caste women activists in both the left and the autonomous women's movements. And the core concern with social justice in inequality has, however, remained constant. So, this idea that the women's movements should ask for equality and social justice has remained constant, although the ways in which it happens has changed. In contrast, the popular representation of feminism in media basically reflects a very detached kind of representation where questions of class, caste and social justice are erased. Feminism is read here as a matter of the individual women's right to choose, and this woman is concerned either this women is represented as a corporate or a high powered consumer. So, you do not see representations of normal ordinary rural women or ordinary urban women, but only women who have certain sense of agency. What this does is basically neoliberalize and commodify the way that feminism is represented. One significant example is the way the International Women's Day is marketed in the media. So, this day has a history which is rooted in the socialist groups all over the world asking for women's rights and women's work to be recognized. One of the very major parts of the International Women's Day has also been this demand to recognize housework as work, because housework has always been work, only that women have been neglected, subjugated and also unpaid for performing housework. But today when you see representations of International Women's Day, this history is erased. It has generally now being represented as only International Women's Day and not as International Working Women's Day, where corporates like spas as well as parlors, they would provide women with certain kind of discounts and offers to basically also placate this identity of a woman and bring it under that neoliberal ambit and commodify the idea of feminism. So, again the women who have been the backbone of these movements seeking for rights, they are completely erased from the discussion. The representation here is of only women with certain agency, and you also find a commodified way in which this idea and day is represented. So, what one sees is, instead of how the issue should be historicized, contextually, culturally located, that gets erased in the discussion. So, this discussion on the International Women's Day basically also tells us how it has been traditionally celebrated by women's organizations and political forces which align themselves quite unambiguously with democratic and progressive forces. But now you see advertisements with specific messages which appear on 8 March. Chaudhary gives the example of Pond's, which created an ad titled "The Millennium Miracle," a curtain raiser with an image of a woman's mask, an hourglass and some paint brushes. The text reads, "As we are poised for a flight into 2000, what does it portend for women?" And a closer look at the trend-setting explosions on the careers, fashion, fitness and beauty minefields. She is what makes the world go round, yesterday, today, in the new millennium and for eternity. Then you see a logo with "There's tomorrow because there's you, Women's Day, a celebration of womanhood, March 8th. This ad represents high-powered beauty shows that have been marketed as matters of choice, upward mobility, success and agency. Very interestingly, this analysis of the ad that Chaudhary presents actually tells us how women's issues are represented in the media. So, while the feminist movement has critiqued women's association with beauty and its related images, where people have written about how beauty becomes a way to subjugate women, the very ads which market International Women's Day and these beauty pageants as well, which talk about women empowerment, women rights, etc., they completely erase the cultural context in which the feminist movement had critiqued these representations, and instead take forward a representation which is not critical, but actually, you know, aligning with how the society wants to view the women's rights. So, the beauty pageants themselves have been seen as ways to achieve upward mobility, success and agency. But we often also do not ask the questions of whose agency, whose transformation. What you see therefore is basically an overall transformation of the media, where the sponsors, the advertisers, they lay down the rules, and what you see is ads, sales, market strategies ruling the rooster. So, you have frequent write-ups on child rearing, housekeeping, domesticity, professional attire, demeanor, which are also presented as news items and researched pieces, but are also in reality sponsoring certain products. The articles on, you know, lifestyles of rich and famous people, interviews with models, they curate an image of a woman that you should take care of your body, you should be very conscious of how you look, and you can do it. It is very easy. All you need is some good food, some, you know, rest and some yoga or exercise. These representations do not ask the very important question of how are these activities at leisure, at relaxation, at beauty upkeep and maintenance possible for the majority of the women in India or elsewhere who spend most of their time taking care of their jobs, their families, their children, etc. So, what you see is how women's rights, questions of, you know, women empowerment and feminism itself being misrepresented. This takes us to the way that we have been discussing representation, and again the idea of, is representation enough, or there should be more nuanced representations? Should there be more politically conscious, socially, culturally, historically rooted representations, or, you know, we are okay with simply bringing in women as part of the representations? Now, this particular work by Chaudhary also highlights how ads in print media at a particular time period, much before the era that we are living in today, used these you know, buzzwords like choice, autonomy, agency, etc., to talk about women's rights. One can see very similar representations actually in the digital age, where the real women and issues that should be focused in terms of why women are still lagging behind in many ways, that completely again get erased. So, every year there could be certain stories where you are told that girls are doing very well in schools, they are on the path to empowerment. These stories reported in the media are true to an extent, but it is also true that many women are still you know, kept out of the education process. There are dropouts, etc. Both stories need to be covered equally, so that the representation that we are witnessing and we are consuming as basically audiences are accurate, or rather, you know, at least somewhere close to being accurate. So, this is why what we require is also a critical lens to understand how media representations work at multiple levels, and in this lecture the attempt has been to look at, you know, gender as a social category and how it has been represented primarily in, let us say, print media. Thank you.